Welcome to A Conversation with History. My name is Harry Kreisler. Our guest today is Fred Wyle, an attorney who served in the Kennedy-Johnson administrations as an official in the State Department and the Pentagon. Fred, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Berlin, Germany, and arrived in the United States at the age of 11, and was raised in New York till the age of 18, and then went off into the Army and into college in Massachusetts, and that would be the end of my raising, I guess.
I see. And what was this? Is there any odyssey here in going from Berlin to the United States? Did you come directly to the United States?
No, we had an 8-month period in what was then known as Palestine, now Israel, which was a way station before we got here.
Mm-hmm. What got you interested in international politics, foreign policy, and the law?
I don't know. I was always interested in it from an early age, and I wanted to do law and I wanted to do foreign policy. So I managed, in a way, to do both.
And was it world events? Were you a newspaper reader?
I guess I must have been, but I don't really recall the specifics. I think you just are or you aren't interested in the world.
Any teachers when you were younger, before you went to Harvard as an undergraduate, who shaped the direction you took?
No.
Okay.
I'm a self-shaper.
Self-shaper. And so you went to Harvard as an undergraduate,
right.
And this would have been after you had been in the military.
Right. After high school, I did a year in the military, and then I went to Harvard.
And what was it like to get into the military? You had problems getting in, but you wanted in, actually, right?
Well, yes. This was 1946. The draft was ending, and in my area it had ended. So I had to find a place where the draft was still going, because I couldn't enlist because of my eyesight. And the guy at the enlisting station suggested I volunteer for induction. Mm-hmm. So I volunteered for induction in a district that was still going. And so that's how I got into the military.
So a district that was still taking draftees.
Still taking draftees.
Right.
Sort of the last train.
And so what was your plan once you were in the military, and did it go well?
Well, yeah, in a way. I was classified to go to Europe as an interpreter because I spoke several European languages. And I wound up in Japan on a rifle range. So, it prepared me for the way of large institutions. Was Japan a culture shock? Or was the Army the bigger culture shock? Well, neither one really a shock, but they were both great experiences in the sense that I think every young person ought to have an experience like the Army or maybe some other institutions, the Peace Corps and so on. And Japan was, at that time still, this was 1946, 1947, was still a marvelously rural country and beautiful beyond belief. So I was very impressed by that and Japanese culture generally.
And you said that you were working on a firing range. Did you adjust, given your background, to learning to handle firearms?
Yeah, I don't think there was any adjustment. You just
you just shoot.
You just shoot. And we had to repair, maintain a large number of weapons for the occupation troops.
And you would have been what age when you were in Japan?
18.
18. I noticed in the paper that you gave me to read that you had actually gone to Hiroshima at this time.
Yes, I managed to get there.
How did that affect you?
Well, you can't see it without being affected. It's a little hard to say how the effect works, but there was this gigantic rubble field and then the one standing skeleton of a building over which the bomb had exploded. So it impresses you with the power of atomic weapons and the new age we're into.
In a few minutes, we'll talk about your experience in the government, but you were actually working on the management and control of nuclear weapons. Did that image remain in your mind, or is it something that you wind up forgetting?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No. The atomic weapons are, and the risks of the future are sufficient in themselves. You don't need any extra images from prior events.
Mm-hmm. So after the military, then you enter Harvard as an undergraduate.
Right.
What did you major in?
Political science, I'm afraid.
So was any harm done to you in that set of studies? Or?
Well, I think I missed the opportunity to learn something of our civilization and history and art and literature and the kinds of things that I think you should do in college. Political science is something you can probably just get by reading the newspapers.
And you did quite well in the Moot Court. Tell us about that.
Well, they have a program where you divide up in your freshman year into teams, and the teams compete against each other in Moot Court, meaning make-believe court. And then the winners of the first year go into the second year, and then the winners of the second year go into the last third year, and my team won the 3-year competition. So it took a lot of time and effort, and it was quite thrilling because the last argument includes one of the Supreme Court justices as a judge.
You went on to do a lot of legal work, primarily in bankruptcy law, but I'm curious about what you think are the skills that a person needs to have to do law well?
Well, actually, I did normal law work, litigation, before I slid into bankruptcy. But the skills, I think if you have common sense and you're skeptical and you want to double check things and you're persistent and hardworking, then you'll make a good lawyer. I don't think the law skills are very different from anything else, investment banking or even academic.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the art of persuasion? You were in Moot Court. I mean, obviously there is the persuasion in terms of preparing the briefs and so on, but also the arguments that have to be made orally.
Yeah, it's mostly substance, not rhetorical skill or flourishes or wonderful enunciation or any of that. It's very much hard work. You imagine all the possible loopholes, all the possible questions, and you try to cover them, and so that you're prepared when the final argument comes for anything that may happen. Most of the time, hard work can do it for you.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you mentioned, you went into general litigation. You were at a New York law firm. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I started as a judge to a district court judge here in San Francisco, but then I went to New York with a firm called Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And in the litigation section, I was there, and I was very lucky in my subject matter because the day I arrived, I got handed a case which included Marilyn Monroe. And I also had the opportunity to work on the defense of Arthur Miller, the playwright, against an attempt by a committee of Congress, the Un-American Activities Committee, to hold him in contempt for refusing to answer a question.
Let's talk about Arthur Miller in a few moments when we talk about the problem of civil liberties, but we should talk about Marilyn Monroe. What was that like to have Marilyn Monroe as one of your first clients? Well,
I mean, it was obviously, I guess, a thrill or something. But I never met her in the course of that case. I met her later in the other case. But it was a very simple contract case and didn't take much effort.
The first case was really about somewhat a photographer essentially was trying to take her to the cleaners.
This fellow had induced her to incorporate herself with him as the other member of the corporation, and she had wanted artistic control, and he said, you don't need artistic control because 51% of the corporation controls anyway, and I'm going to give you 51 shares. Mm-hmm. He did give her 51 shares, but he issued 101 shares, so she didn't quite have 51%. Mm-hmm. So it was a very simple fraud case.
Well, what was your general impression of her? I mean, obviously at that time, had she yet become the icon that she subsequently became?
Yes.
I mean, is there some thought you want to leave us with, about her?
Well, I met her only later, as I said, in the Arthur Miller case. I felt, after seeing her a little bit, I felt she did need help and protection. I think she was essentially a victim in various ways. But initially I was a little standoffish because I didn't want to fawn on her the way most people did. Mm-hmm. But as I saw her a little more, I felt she needed protection.
Mm-hmm. What led you to go into the government after this initial period in litigation? Because at a certain point, you actually join in with the Kennedy administration.
Yeah, well, I think maybe the fact of the Kennedy administration being fresh and new and ambitious and full of interesting people pushed me over into going and seeing whether I could get into that crowd.
Mm-hmm. Well, help us understand the excitement of that period. I mean, some of us remember that, but more and more young people have no sense of the possibilities that the new frontier seemed to offer.
Well, you know, it became later described as Camelot. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's an exaggeration. But there was something of that spirit, that here were high-minded, well-intentioned people of high ability who were streaming into the government and to do good things. And I think there was some of that spirit around. Mm-hmm. And so I yielded to that spirit very easily.
Mm-hmm. And what sorts of jobs that you had? First, you were a NATO representative, a U.S. representative to NATO in Europe?
Well, when I signed on, I was in San Francisco at that time. When I signed on, I went to Paris with our NATO delegation to NATO, and I was a special assistant to the defense representative for that area.
Mm-hmm. And then you were at policy planning for a while in the State Department?
Then I came back and worked at the Pentagon, and then I spent a couple of years at the Policy Planning Council of the Department of State as a member. And then I came back to the Pentagon and stayed there for 4 or 5 years.
And this would have, been, of course, been in the 60s. And you rose to the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense?
Yes.
Is that right? Right. And what was the area that you focused on?
Europe and the NATO, the nuclear business, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. And help us, it was a very different world in our attitude toward nuclear weapons that emerged before you were in government in the 50s. The nuclear weapons were seen as something that would empower us to meet a Soviet threat with what I believe Dulles called massive retaliation.
Well, there were two different things. The strategic approach, where you wipe each other out, that's the massive retaliation and the mutual assured destruction business. But in Europe, in the 50s, the Europeans and the United States were gripped by the fear of the Soviet hordes, you know, massive, massive conventional forces that the Russians were thought to have and in part did have. And they thought nuclear weapons was the only possible answer to that. As you know, thinking matured about that and facts changed, it turned out that nuclear weapons in Europe, tactical nuclear weapons so-called, wouldn't do anything for you. You could conceivably destroy all of Europe in the course of defending it. It was nonsense. Mm-hmm. And so the McNamara regime set about correcting that craziness and the misimpression. And the militaries of all the European countries were wedded to the notion of relying on nuclear weapons as the answer, not only for deterrence, but even actually warfighting. Mm-hmm. And we tried very hard to get them to face reality, which is that if you use a nuclear weapon on them to show your determination, and they use a nuclear weapon on you to show their determination, where have you gotten? What's next? Wipe out everything? And so we argued for increasing conventional forces to the point where you could answer any attack by them that was only conventional. And in fact, we had the resources, taking the alliance as a whole, to do that. Mm-hmm. But people didn't believe that. So we had quite a bit of work to show them rationally why this was true.
Now, this was called flexible response.
That was one name for it, yeah.
Yes, that you
respond to whatever level is necessary to hold the attack.
And not immediately rush to the use of nuclear.
Right.
Yeah.
The idea is to put the monkey on their back of going into a nuclear
that is, there being the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yeah. Now, this was a conundrum of political issues and so on, and we should remind our audience that the Europeans were dependent on us for their defense.
Right.
So there was a sense in which who does what and who pays for what, and you were in the middle of that set of problems.
Yeah, I think the Europeans, essentially wanted reassurance that we would go to nuclear war to defend them. Mm-hmm. And de Gaulle, if you remember, always doubted that and doubted it very publicly. Mm-hmm. And that was his rationale for developing the French nuclear force. As the facts about what would happen if we did have a tactical nuclear war in Europe were borne in upon the Europeans, they changed their mind and they began to accept our arguments that all you need to do is increase your conventional forces somewhat so as to be able to hold off the Soviets and make them worry about whether they want to go to nuclear war. Mm-hmm. And in time, I think we convinced them, but it took 4, 5, 6 years.
But once you're getting into conventional forces, then you're getting into arguments, well, who pays for what and what percentage of your GNP is covering defense?
Well, actually, the Europeans always had a much lower percentage of their GNP devoted to defense than we did. Mm-hmm. Because, as you point out, they really relied upon us. They basically started thinking whatever they had to add to the pot wasn't going to make any difference, and it's really all the U.S. And if the Soviets feared the U.S. response, that would be enough. So we had a hard time convincing them to do a little more on conventional forces, beef up the quality and training and the equipment and so on.
Do you think it was in this period when Europe moved into the realm that we find them now, where they are essentially free riders on defense? They really don't worry about it as much and don't want to put funds into it?
Well, I think the reasons are different, but the basic instinct remains the same. Mm-hmm. They were free riders to some extent. I don't want to exaggerate that. The Germans and the British and the French did make efforts on defense, but not nearly as much as we did. Today, it's that I think they have a different argument for not doing so much, namely, the Russians have become sort of no longer a big threat. I think that's exaggerated because the Russians could become, let's say, a bully, and they've already started a little bit with the gas and the oil and so on. And the quality of your relationship reflects the reality of your power. And if the Europeans are as weak in their defense efforts as they might be or might become, that gives the Russians more ammunition to bully them. And, this is a delicate thing and has to do with diplomacy and psychology. It's not an outright defense threat, but it's a fact of international life.
You worked in the Pentagon at a time when Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, and he took a leadership role in turning the Europeans around on these issues of. Talk a little about that and his, because in reading your papers, I had the sense that he understood the political dynamics and was willing to invest time and energy in political education, putting the right group together to make the Europeans understand the dangers of nuclear weapons.
Yes, I think the problem that he faced was that many of the European political leaders like to hive off defense into the military area and have little to do with it and rely upon their chiefs of staff and so on. And McNamara wanted to have the politically responsible leaders face up to the facts of nuclear war and not be able to say, oh, I leave that to my military. So he went about an education program where we showed the European political leaders exactly what would happen if there was a nuclear war in Europe or worldwide by showing them the targeting and the potential outcome and so on. And in order to make the political leaders take it aboard, he even designed a special table consisting of, it's a small table, consisting of just enough room for the political leaders and not their military aides. Mm-hmm. And that was actually quite effective.
And so he really wanted to run he was running a tutorial, basically,
yes,
for them to understand what the implications were of relying on nuclear weapons.
And he wanted to make sure that they couldn't hive that off to their military, but they had to face up to it because they were the political responsible people, cabinet members, defense ministers.
His great achievement, I think, and I want to ask you about this, is control of nuclear weapons and rationalizing the arsenal that we had.
I would say on control of nuclear weapons, yes, very much so, because he and President Kennedy were the first ones who were able, in effect, to achieve pretty good control over nuclear weapons abroad and the strategic nuclear weapons, proper systems of control, the so-called permissive action link, and that kind of thing. On the second element, which was...
Well, just control of nuclear weapons.
Yes, on that,
yeah.
But you mentioned another one.
I don't remember. Okay, so we'll just have to proceed.
Yeah.
But in other words, that he saw that they had to be controlled and managed.
Yes,
really.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the important thing was that he wanted to bring it home to the political leaders what they were talking about when they said, oh, yeah, well, we'll threaten them with nuclear weapons and so on.
Of course, we remember McNamara for the Vietnam debacle. How do you square these two sides of him? One, you know, the person who could see the problems of nuclear weapons and politically manage their control both among the Europeans and at home, versus the Vietnam War, where he basically seemed not to understand the dynamics on the ground.
Well, A, I don't square it. B, I think he did understand much sooner than many others that the thing was hopeless, but he felt, in my view, an exaggerated and somewhat misguided loyalty to the president in publicly supporting it. I think he did his best to rationalize it by his own view, and it doesn't rationalize. So, you know, I think it was a great strain on him, and it was tearing him apart. But he hid that, you know, and he didn't allow that to be publicly seen. So I don't square it. I think if I'd been advising him, I would have said, stand up and say how you really feel about this. But he did not. He felt loyal to the president.
What is your overall evaluation of him as a manager, as a Secretary of Defense, and as an actor in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations?
Well, I think that his historic service to the country is that he did manage to put major controls on nuclear weapons, which up to that time really had been much too loosely controlled, in my view. And so I think that's a lasting thing to keep us alive. And I think he deserves great credit for that, and Jack Kennedy for backing him in that. Beyond that, on the Vietnam thing, you know, there were so many people who went wrong on that I don't think he stands out, except that he was so competent that he managed to make it seem more rational than it was.
As somebody who was in the administration, you were at a high enough level to see the qualities of character and foibles among a number of the key actors at that time. Clark Clifford, who sort of changed the Vietnam policy. Yeah. What were your observations of him?
Of him, of Clark Clifford?
Yeah.
Well, he was a marvelous character. A wonderful lawyer, of course, but also political thinker. And shortly before he came in as Secretary of Defense, he'd been sent around on a mission to see how the world thinks about Vietnam. And on that trip, on that mission, he actually, I think, came to the conclusion that it was a gigantic tragedy and so on. So by the time he was sworn in as Secretary of Defense, he was pretty much ready to be persuaded that we had to get out. And he pretty soon took up the major role in pushing for us to get out that actually has been associated with the Pentagon more than with others. Mm-hmm. But my perception of the people otherwise that you were asking about, I'm talking now about the civilians, as well as some of the military, is that they were an extraordinarily capable, bright, highly motivated group, especially around the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm. I know my sense of you in talking with you on other occasions is that you have a sense of the limits of foreign policy and the sometimes difficult efforts to institute solutions to problems. And I know that as the United States addressed this problem of what to do with the Europeans about nuclear weapons, one of the ideas that came up was something called the multilateral force, which really is an indicator of how projects can be foolish in their original conception, but have a life of their own. Yeah. And it's a question of closing them. And tell us what that was and some of the absurdities you encountered.
Well, I think of it as the multilateral farce.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was, and it arose in the State Department, the idea was we don't want the Germans to go and get nuclear weapons. On the other hand, nuclear weapons were very much a part of the defense situation and so on. So the Germans were bound sooner or later to want to have a hand on nuclear weapons. So the way to abort that is to create a multilateral force in which various countries, including the Germans, would all be involved, and they would sail around in ships that would have nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles on them, and somehow or other, if they all agreed to fire the missiles, they could be fired. This could be the multilateral force, nuclear force. In defense terms, it made no sense at all, because what a couple of missiles on a ship would do in a worldwide strategic holocaust was marginal, less than marginal. But it was also silly, because if you had a veto for one of 5 or 6 people on it, it wouldn't work anyway. Besides which, it would frighten everybody, including the Russians, of the Germans with nuclear weapons. And the Germans themselves were appalled when they first heard of this notion that we were going to get them close to nuclear weapons, because they otherwise would have a future appetite for nuclear weapons. They said, for God's sakes, we don't have an appetite. Please don't go around saying we have an appetite.
Mm-hmm. Because, of course, all of Europe, part of the problem of uniting Europe was how do we contain Germany from what it had been in the past.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there was a good progress in accepting the Germans as being now peace-loving and all that. But this notion of allying them with nuclear weapons alarmed everybody. And the State Department somehow pushed this project long enough so that it became a big political issue, and people tried various ways to avoid that. And for my sins, I was condemned to work on it and to elaborate exactly how you would do it. And my instructions were, Fred, we know you think it's crazy, but if it weren't crazy, how would you do it? Mm-hmm. So I worked with 5 Navy captains, and we did the big Bible on how you would do it. Fortunately, Lyndon Johnson, I think, got information from Fulbright, Senator Fulbright, that the Europeans all hated the idea and so on, and he just canceled it, which was a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, your work at this time was about, well, how do we work with our allies to make sense of nuclear policy, even if that means limiting the extent to which we will use nuclear weapons. But early on, I think you were concerned also and involved in a project looking at the danger of losing control of some of the plutonium used in nuclear weapons. Talk a little about that and that particular problem, namely, how do we ensure the safety, of nuclear facilities and make certain that the nuclear material, in this case plutonium, is not either seized in a theft or in some way fall into the hands of terrorists.
Yeah, you're referring to a project that was after my government service in 1975. Right. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had heard a lot about the impact on civil liberties of the safety features and got a project going to look at that. And it was done by a Stanford law professor and a panel of people participating, including myself. The problem at that time was a fear that we were going to go into reprocessing used uranium in power plants and so on and create plutonium, pure plutonium, which was itself a source of either power or nuclear weapons. And the risk of producing pure plutonium all over the country and shipping it and storing it and so on was really a great security risk. And fortunately, we did not go into that. But at the time I wrote the paper, that was a risk. And the problem is that if you create materials that could be used for either a dirty bomb or radiation poisoning or even components of a nuclear weapon, sooner or later somebody will steal it, sell it, black market it, and so on, some of which has happened subsequently. And so you have to apply safety and guard facilities and security facilities which go beyond anything now in place or then in place. And I hope some of it's been done, but I don't see a lot of evidence. And just to give you an example, in California law, you're not allowed to use lethal force to stop the mere theft of property. So you can't kill somebody to keep them from stealing your bicycle. And if that were applied to harmful nuclear substances, you could have a thief make off with it.
And because the nuclear material might be owned by a private company.
It might be owned by a private company or by a lab or by a university or a medical facility or the government or a power plant. And so you want to extend to those facilities adequate guarding facilities or protection of various kinds, which might include such a thing as a guard being able to fire on people who are breaking in or stealing it, and so on. And that kind of thing. But I think this is a huge problem because a lot of countries abroad do not have the facilities that we have for guarding stuff and are not in as tight control as we are. And of course, you're aware of the Russian situation where we put up several billions of dollars to fix their faulty guard facilities. It's the Nunn-Lugar bill, but it's a great irony. Here we are paying Russians to fix their own lacking facilities. But it's a kind of blackmail, but we have to do it.
This 1974 project that you worked on, I think it was 74, 75, yeah. Also focused on the problem of civil liberties, because once there's a theft, and the government, whoever the authority is, realizes it, then what happens to civil liberties as they go on a hunt for the material or the thieves? Well,
I'm an early card-carrying civil libertarian, so I value civil liberties greatly. But I think the threat is now so different from anything that we've faced before that we have to find ways of improving or modifying our notions about civil liberties so that we protect the maximum possible amount of it, but that we meet the exigent needs of better protection, better security for nuclear materials and the nuclear threat generally. How that's to be done is a big subject, and we've got lots of good people who can work on it. But it has to be done, and us civil libertarians have to acknowledge that it'll have to have some changes. In
the project that you worked on, the paper that you wrote really talked about bringing the civil libertarian, the ACLU, into the considerations of how the law might have to change under the circumstances of a real threat.
Yeah, I think we have to persuade the civil liberties community that some changes are just essential because of the nature of the new threat. Mm-hmm. And it's better to do that in conversation with them and convincing them. And I think they're not crazy. They will convince to some extent. And it's in everybody's interest that we do this thoughtfully and ahead of time rather than wait for another 9/11, then rush out and pass some kind of far-reaching thing that's not thought through and that's not carefully tested ahead of time.
As somebody who participated in the government quite actively in an earlier period where the circumstances were very different, how do you evaluate the government's response, the Bush administration's response to the events of 9/11 over time? I mean, do you feel comfortable giving that some sort of a report card? Because some of the threats that they were dealing with are reminiscent of this project that you were working on, where now the threat is international, it's terrorists, and it's terrorists who've said that they could conceive of detonating a dirty bomb or a nuclear device.
Yeah, well, I think the threat is real because the materials have become more available, and we've had Dr. Khan, the Pakistani, teaching people how to do it and selling stuff and so on. And you've got the North Koreans, you've got potentially the Iranians. So the threat is real that material can be stolen or passed on voluntarily to North Koreans, who knows. So the threat is real. How to deal with it thoughtfully but effectively is a big problem. I think the post 9/11 rush to some of these statutes, the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act, are pretty rough and are not as thought through as I'd like to see them, and I think lots of people are working on it. The problems are very different, though. You know, you have people in Guantanamo, for instance, who are there because somebody told the U.S. that these guys are bad guys. Now, they may be, but they may not be. And so you have to have some procedures in place that sorts that out, not just we can't tell you anything about our sources. It could be nothing more than somebody earning money by turning in somebody, or it could be that it's a really bad guy. Mm-hmm. So we have to find ways of getting better information than we have on these people and better protection for them, too. Because you can't just say, I'm going to grab a citizen or a non-citizen and lock him up for life or indefinitely or however long I say that the emergency lasts, and not let him know why he's there, or not have him talk to a lawyer and so on. So how to calibrate that without losing effectiveness is the problem. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think there should be lots better communication between the civil liberties community and the executive branch and the legislative branch. Mm-hmm. And I hope that's good. And the courts.
Yeah, and the courts.
But you can't negotiate with the courts. I mean, the courts have to make up their mind of whether you're within the Constitution or not, and they are entitled to take into account the nature of the threat, but they still have the job of trying to minimize damage to the Constitution. So that's the big problem relating to the terrorists, aside from doing much better than we're doing now on border control.
Mm-hmm. As a practicing attorney, what does the law bring to this set of conundrums and in helping us understand the elements of the problem?
Well, I think the understanding of how things can go wrong and damage your civil liberties is what the lawyers can bring to it. Mm. The notion of how to be more effective against the threat and minimizing the damage to civil liberties is something they can be effective on too. So, you know, you have to have the executive that's responsible in the end. But better communication before rushing a statute to the Congress and sort of stampeding the Congress into passing it would be a good thing.
Earlier you talked about your being part of the defense of Arthur Miller. That goes back to an earlier period where the problem was McCarthyism,
right,
and so on. But it actually tells us something about, within a threatening environment, how certain institutions can abuse their power for political ends, but the law can intervene to make a difference. Talk about a little about Miller's case. I mean, it's a different environment. I understand that, but I mean, some of the lessons there may relate to today.
Well, this was the Un-American Activities Committee of ill repute, and it was in the in the late 50s and early 60s. Arthur Miller had, in the 30s, been invited by a bunch of writers, most of whom were communists, to read a paper at their literary salon on the artist in society or something like that. And he came and he read his paper, and they said to him, well, you're hopelessly bourgeois, you don't understand our great communist truths, and so on. Go away. He said, well, that's the way I feel. That was that. Much later, 20 years later roughly, the Un-American Activities Committee had a reign of terror for a while, and they were kind of losing attention in the press and the public when Arthur Miller married Marilyn Monroe, and this hit the papers, of course, in a big way. And one of the staff members of the committee remembered seeing Arthur Miller's name somewhere, and he went back to the records and he found that Arthur Miller had this meeting. The committee was supposed to investigate passport abuse by presumed communists, and it had nothing to do with, you know, literary seminars. But anyway, Arthur Miller obviously had had many passports, you know, traveled abroad. And so that was enough for them, and they subpoenaed him and asked him to tell his story, and he told his story. And they said, oh, you're a wonderful American, and you're a wonderful person, and you married Marilyn Monroe, and isn't that wonderful? And so on. Now give us the names of these people. And he, at that point, said, no, I don't want to do that because it doesn't have anything to do with anything. These people are now living all over the country. If I give you the names, it would ruin their lives, and so on and so forth. And they meant to insist that he give them the names, then he didn't. And so they launched a proceeding for contempt of Congress, criminal. And I was with a firm which defended him. And so I was sent down to work on the case in Washington. We did defend him, and we established the principle that if the purpose, if the question asked is not related to the purpose for which the Congress has told the committee it should operate, then they can't send somebody to jail for refusing to answer a question which is unrelated to what they were supposed to be studying. That was, at that point, not yet the law. But a short while later, while we were appealing the conviction of Arthur Miller, the Supreme Court came out saying exactly that. Mm-hmm. And both cases were run for the defense by Joseph Rao, a great libertarian. And he had previously had that case, and the Supreme Court said so. So that, you know, it's an establishment of a principle that you can't, just because you're entitled to ask questions on the proper subject, you can't send somebody to jail for an improper question. You know, supposing they'd asked him, which vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream do you prefer? And he said, I refuse to answer. We can't send him to jail for that.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I bring this case up from the past is that it seems to sort of give us insight into how the institutions can work, and also individuals in the law, and in this case Joseph Rao, to essentially call the government to account when it goes too far in trying to deal with what it perceives to be a threat.
Well, I think it demonstrates the function of the law, the courts and lawyers, to say that when you infringe upon personal liberty, you should do so only to the extent necessary, made necessary by the threat. And here the threat, or the purpose of the committee, was to investigate communism and so on, which in the abstract is certainly a threat. But when they use that power to go beyond what's necessary to do it properly, the law can step in to protect you. And I think that principle is exactly the same principle that applies everywhere in the law and the Constitution and the courts.
And in this particular case, you were working with Joseph Rao. Tell us a little about him, because in the history of American civil liberties, he's a truly important figure.
Yes, he's one of the great civil liberties lawyers, and he was personally a marvelous guy. He had an ever youthful nature into a high age, and was a wonderful lawyer, had been a Supreme Court clerk and so on and so forth. And he was just always ready to take on a worthy cause, and he was a much admired man certainly in civil liberties circles, and he was respected, I think, by even right-wingers. He was a great guy, and it was a wonderful experience to work with him.
Now, he, I believe, was the chief counsel also on the defense of the anthropologist who wanted to interfere with the atomic testing.
Yes.
Tell us about that, because I think that story is fascinating, because it's this play of law, the individual, the great attorney, and so on.
This is in the late 50s. Dr. Earl Reynolds was an American, I think, biologist.
Anthropologist, I think.
Anthropologist, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, he was studying at Tokyo University the survivors of the Hiroshima thing. And he got so emotionally involved with the subject that at that time we were about to do the Bikini H-bomb test. And he got so emotionally involved that he decided he would go out and protest it. So he got a sailing boat, called the Phoenix. And he, his wife, and a young Japanese crewman set out to sail into the bomb test area as a protest. Well, the poor AEC, confronted with this...
That would be the Atomic Energy Commission.
The Atomic Energy Commission said, my God, what do we do now? And what they did is they quickly passed a regulation that said you can't enter into an atomic area, test area. And they said, all right, this part of the Pacific is now an atomic test area, and you can't enter into it. If you do enter into it, it's a criminal offense. So Dr. Reynolds sailed off, and the Coast Guard or somebody trailed him. And when he got to the atomic test area, a huge part of the Pacific, they put a line on him and towed him back to Honolulu and tried him for a criminal case for entering into an atomic test area and so on. And Joe Rao represented him, and I was practicing law in San Francisco, and he called me and said, we have a problem, would you do something for us? What had happened is Reynolds was convicted, but both the district attorney and the judge were so taken with him by his high moral integrity that they said to him, you know, you're a wonderful guy, but we have to convict you, we're sorry. And he said, okay, well, can I go back to Tokyo University during the appeal? We were going to appeal it, obviously. Joe Rao was. And they said, well, we have no doubt you would show up if you have to, but we have this rule in the district that says anybody convicted can't leave the district during the appeal. But we have no doubt you would, you're very honorable and so on. So that was the issue I was confronted with, and I went to the Ninth Circuit and said, look, the reason for the rule of not leaving the district is that the guy might be a flight risk. Here, both the judge and the district attorney had said, we don't have any doubt about that, you will appear. But when the reason for the rule disappears, the rule disappears. Old Latin maxim, and it's actually part of California law. And the Ninth Circuit didn't buy the argument. Mm-hmm. So Joe Rao went and got a hold of Justice William Douglas, who was the Ninth Circuit Supreme Court Justice. And they found him climbing around in the Himalayas. And they said, look, Judge, when the reason for the rule disappears, right? He said, yes, of course. And he signed an order that let Dr. Reynolds go back to Tokyo during the appeal. On the appeal, we won the appeal because the court said, look, the Atomic Energy Commission can make these regulations to guide the people it's in contact with. They can't control a stranger. And so that was the end of that. But it was an interesting thing. Again, illustrating the principle we talked about before, mm-hmm. that the law safeguards our civil liberties in limiting the power of the government to what is necessary for its purposes.
We've gone through a dark period where I think it's fair to say that in response to the 9/11 attacks, we weren't seeing the active consultation between the different branches of the government. The administration has, in a way, gone out on a limb on some of the positions which may or may not have been right, but they often were not made with the consultation with the other parts of the government. Does this make you pessimistic, or do you think that the pendulum swings in our system, that our system really works, and that we'll come back to a right place to be to deal with the threats posed by terrorism?
Well, in the past, it always has worked in the sense of a pendulum. It sometimes takes fairly long, maybe take 10 years. But in the end, usually the pendulum comes back and corrects past errors and mistakes and excessive measures. So in that sense, I'm hoping that the pendulum keeps swinging and will end up in the center. The reason to be a little doubtful that that's going to happen is that the nature of the threats we face are so different. I mean, the whole nuclear dimension of our lives now. You remember what Einstein said? He said, when the bomb exploded, he said, everything has changed except the way we think. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem. We can't think any other way than we think, but the facts around us on the nuclear side and now to some extent on the terrorist side have changed to the point where we've got to try real hard to think adequately to the changes.
One final question, Fred. How would you advise students to prepare for the future that you've just described?
I would say don't try to figure out what's best for either law or any other profession. In college, dip into the barrel of civilization that's available to you there. Your natural instincts and gifts will do the rest when you go into a special graduate facility, whether it's law or medicine or engineering or something. Don't really try to guess in advance, but become more civilized than you are when you start this. Because in the end, all those elements of being a civilized person will be more important to you, even in your profession, than anything else. You can learn medicine, you can learn the little details of law school, but the kind of person you are is more affected by what you know about history, literature, civilization, art, music, and so on. And in the end, that's more important than any specialized knowledge which you can pick up later.
Fred, on that note, a very positive note, thank you very much for being on our program.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.